Before I jump into this video, which is my first video back from vacation, I want to give a quick shout out to the 4 people that did guest uploads for me this past week: Simo, Nimnim, House of Champs, and Davinator1212. These people were fantastic and helped me out a ton. As I mentioned in my announcement video, I was gone for that entire week and I didn't really have a way to upload videos, so I reached out to many of my YouTuber friends and colleagues and asked them if they could upload to my channel instead, and I think it worked well for everyone. You guys seem to really like the videos, but now I'm back and now we're going to continue our series on reviewing the trap hole cards. So this set of trap hole cards, the second half, is actually kind of interesting because some of them are really bad, if not the worst trap holes in the bunch, and some of them are actually super impactful and some of the best trap holes in the bunch. So we have a really big sort of discrepancy here where there's really bad trap holes and really good trap holes, but we're going to look at all of them today, which would be, I think it's 8 of them, yeah, 8 of them, and take a look at what made them good or what made them bad. And I wanted to reiterate real quick that what this series aims to do is not talk about so much the potential of these cards, but just talk about how impactful these cards were in their metagames or even down the line. And by doing this, we sort of look at why these cards were played or weren't played, and we're not so much speculating if they could be played, because many of these cards have been around for a while and we kind of can know by now if they're going to see play or not. Anyway, let's jump right in. The first one is Gemini Trap Hole. Activate only when a Gemini monster that is treated as an effect monster is destroyed by battle. Destroy all monsters your opponent controls. Now, what does this sound like? Well, it sounds a lot like Mirror Force. Sounds a lot like a very bad Mirror Force because it doesn't even protect your monster. And yeah, it has the added versatility of hitting things that are in defense position, but in general, that doesn't matter too much. Not many people play a ton of cards in defense position, which means that this card is merely a worse version of Mirror Force, let alone if we compare it to so many different other Mirror Forces. I mean, not even just the basic Mirror Force, which is, this one is clearly a mimic of, but even cards like Quaking Mirror Force or Storming Mirror Force or Blazing Mirror Force are all going to be better than Gemini Trap Hole. This thing in general is kind of a weird card to have the Trap Hole name because it has a battle activated effect. And we can see that with one other trap hole on this list as well, but it's just kind of weird because you think of trap holes as things that activate when your opponent summons a monster or when someone summons a monster, and we have this card as well as one other card that activate when your opponent attacks, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, this card's terrible, so let's move on. Giant Trap Hole is the next card on the list, and it says when 2 or more monsters are special summoned at the same time, destroy all monsters on the field. Now, once again, we've already seen this in a much better card without as much of an activation requirement, and that in this case is Torrential Tribute. So where Gemini Trap Hole sort of was mimicking Mirror Force, although it had some added potential there by destroying all monsters instead of just attack position ones, Giant Trap Hole is pretty much a strictly worse version of Torrential Tribute because it does the exact same sort of thing on resolution, but with a much worse requirement, requiring your opponent to special summon 2. Well, I guess any player could special summon 2 or more monsters at the same time, but why would you want to use this on your own cards? That doesn't make a ton of sense. This card, while it does have the potential to go off, the reason this card was not played is because a card like Bottomless Trap Hole is better when your opponent summons 2 monsters at the same time. A very classic example of this is when your opponent would use Rescue Rabbit and summon 2 copies of Sabersaurus. You would much rather Bottomless Trap Hole them than Giant Trap Hole them because you want them banished. But more importantly, Torrential Tribute is just much better than this card, and it's kind of weird that we have a worse version of Torrential Tribute out there if you didn't know that it existed. I would even go as far as to say that Needle Sealing is more useful than this card, only because it's a lot more flexible, even if it has a pretty steep activation requirement as well. We've even seen cards like Needle Sealing see play compared to Giant Trap Hole, which has basically never seen play. So yeah, this card's pretty bad. Network Trap Hole is next, and this one's actually fairly new, but it has not seen any play since it's been out, and we'll take a look at why. When your opponent special summons a monster or monsters from the main deck or graveyard, banish it face down. Now, anytime a card banishes something face down, that's something worth looking into because that's pretty much the most permanent way to get rid of a card. We used to have a lot of cards that bounce things back to the extra deck, like Compulse. Those saw a lot of play, but that ended up being not enough. We saw a lot of cards like Phoenix Wing Windblast that puts cards back into the deck. That ended up not being enough. Eventually, cards like Bottomless Trap Hole started banishing cards, and that ended up not being enough. So now Network Trap Hole and other cards banish things face down, and is this enough to make this card good? Not really. The reason that this card isn't played is because it's really restrictive on where you can actually use it. It only stops special summons from the main deck or graveyard, and while that is useful, those places are special summoned from pretty often. Maybe not so much the main deck, but the graveyard, yeah, that happens. The main places you want to actually be stopping special summons in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Would either be from the hand or the extra deck especially, and this card works on neither of those places, which makes it pretty limited in its scope. And I probably should mention that I just went through like the different types of removal, and I kind of went out of order in terms of chronological order, but I just kind of go through where things were getting removed in terms of how permanent they were, starting with like going back to the hand or the extra deck, and then going back to the main deck. Cards like Tiramisu were really good as well for that, and then going back to the banished pile was pretty permanent until we got a lot of cards that could recover things from there. And now we're trying to, if you really want to permanently get rid of something, using a card like Network Trap Hole or Eater of Millions to banish it face down seems to be the way to go. The next trap hole is one that was actually played a lot, and that is Time Space Trap Hole. When your opponent special summons a monster or monsters from the hand or extra deck, shuffle that monster into the deck, then you lose 1,000 life points for each return monster. And you can see here, Time Space Trap Hole is doing the exact opposite of Network Trap Hole in terms of what it is countering. Because, like I said, in Network Trap Hole, the main reason the card isn't played is because it doesn't stop special summons from the hand or extra deck, and Time Space Hole literally only stops special summons from those two places, and that makes it pretty useful. This card was played a lot pretty much ever since it came out, and it's not super surprising. You can hit a whole bunch of pendulum monsters with this. That was incredibly good, and yeah, you would lose a lot of life points, but back when pendulums were sort of in their early stages, maybe not like the earliest stage where we have like Clifford's, but the first time that a true pendulum mechanic abusing deck was at the top tables with like Perform Pels and Magicians, Time Space Trap Hole saw a ton of play because they simply just did not have as much recovery as they do right now. So this card's actually pretty good, and it was a nice addition to the Trap Hole arsenal. The other battle-activated trap card is Trap Hole of Spikes, and once again, I don't really understand why these trap holes exist because it seems very off-theme, but let's take a look at it anyway. When an opponent's monster that was normal or special summon this turn declares an attack, destroy that attacking monster, and if you do, inflict damage to your opponent equal to half the original attack of that monster. This card on paper might seem like it has a lot of added benefits, but in reality, it's basically a strictly worse version of Sakuratsu Armor, which is fairly surprising because that card has not seen play in a very, very long time. But when you break this card down, you realize that it's pretty much just Sakuratsu Armor with some extra burn damage, but it has the ridiculous requirement of requiring the opponent's monster to be normal or special summoned that turn. In that case, why don't you just hit it before it gets a chance to attack in the first place? And that's pretty much the overall argument for why battle traps aren't played. In many cases, it's just easier and better, actually, to just kill the card before your opponent gets a chance to attack with it, because by that time, they've probably already used its effects. And in the case of Trap Hole of Spikes, well, it's kind of interesting that it does burn damage, and it potentially could do a lot of burn damage depending on what you hit. The card just isn't good enough to see competitive play. Now, the next card, TRAPTRIX Trap Hole Nightmare, actually saw a ton of play and was one of the main trap holes in the Hat deck way back in 2014. So when a monster that was special summoned this turn activates its effect on your opponent's side of the field, negate that effect, and if you do, destroy that card. Now, you can see this card does have a pretty linear scope. It has to be used not only on a special summon monster, but a monster that was special summoned this turn, which means that your opponent has to summon a monster by a special summon and then use its effect in that very turn. And if it does those things, you can negate the effect and destroy that card. Now, that's a pretty big payoff, and in 2014, this card was incredibly useful. You could use this card against a whole bunch of things, including artifacts and Gear Gigant X, but just like anything that special summons. I mean, there's so many different special summon monsters in the game right now, we might even say that it's not so much of a special summon and it's just a regular type of summon because it happens so often, you don't really have to work for them anymore, if you like to put it that way. But this card just saw so much play, and the big problem with this card, and the reason that it eventually fell off the map, is that if your opponent knows this card exists, then they can simply not activate effects to the turn that the cards are special summoned to play around around it, then this card just sits face down forever. And I think we saw this a lot in the Geargia matchup. People would summon Geargia X and simply pass turn without using its search effect, and then get its search effect on the next turn when your opponent could not TRAPTRIX Trap Hole Nightmare it. Because a lot of times what would happen is if your opponent had TRAPTRIX Trap Hole Nightmare and a bottomless Trap Hole face down, and you summon Geargia X, they would not flip up the bottomless because they would be like, oh, I'm just going to hit it with Nightmare to destroy it and negate the search effect. And in that case, you would now dodge the bottomless Trap Hole and the TRAPTRIX Trap Hole Nightmare if you simply waited one turn to get that search effect. So that's worth mentioning. But this card still saw a ton of play and a ton of success as well, so it's really worth mentioning. And the next one is Treacherous Trap Hole. If you have no trap cards in your graveyard, target 2 monsters on the field, destroy those targets. And there's a couple things worth noting about this card. Yes, it did see play when it first came out. It saw play in some Light Sworn decks and some other Monster Mash variants. It might not seem that good right now to sort of, why would you just play this card in a deck that doesn't want to play traps? Because in the decks that you don't want to play traps in, well, you don't want to even just play a one of Treacherous Trap Hole. But this card did see play. It's a pretty free card if you can activate it. It doesn't really require any setup. You just have to blow up 2 cards on the board. You can even target your own monsters if you need to. But this card's really cool, and the reason this card is really cool right now is because of Rafflesia. Rafflesia can simply send this card from your deck to the graveyard, so you don't have to worry about drawing it. And while Rafflesia eventually did not play Treacherous Trap Hole anymore, it did see play for a brief period of time when it first came out. And I think at this point, though, people are mostly just sticking to Floodgate Trap Hole or Bottomless Trap Hole. But Treacherous Trap Hole did see some play with Rafflesia because people were playing it alongside cards like Solemn Strike as well, because one of the cool things about Rafflesia is that you could use it before you activated any of your other trap cards to make sure that you actually didn't have any traps in your grave when you resolve the Treacherous Trap Hole. So Treacherous Trap Hole, maybe not so good anymore, but it did have lots of different formats where it was played, not only with Rafflesia, but also without Rafflesia. Now, the last trap hole on this entire list, this is the last, we've reviewed every trap hole card except this one, is one that is possibly my personal favorite, and that is Void Trap Hole. I love this card. Look at its artwork. There's so much going on. It got Gungnir in there, I believe, and Void Trap Hole is super cool, and it's also sort of an interesting take on the TRAPTRIX Trap Hole Nightmare idea, and it was played in replacement to Nightmare in some hat decks by the end of that format. So when an opponent special summons a monster or monsters with 2,000 or more attack, negate the effects of one of those monsters, and if you do, destroy it. So this card technically can be used in response to the summon of multiple cards, but it will only take care of one of them, which is worth noting, not like Bottomless Trap Hole, which will banish all of them. Why was this card played as a replacement to Nightmare or in supplement to Nightmare? Well, the reason is that this card sort of plays around your opponent playing around Nightmare. If your opponent summons Geargia X and plans to not use the effect, well, you can simply hit it with Void Trap Hole, because all it requires your opponent to do is special summon a monster with 2,000 or more attack. Now, you can see here that some of these good trap holes do have pretty hefty activation requirements, very similar to the first two that I talked about in this video, Gemini Trap Hole and Giant Trap Hole. The difference is that while those cards were worse versions of cards like Mirror Force and Torrential Tribute, these last couple that only work on like special summon monsters, or in the case of Void Trap Hole, only work on special summon monsters with 2,000 or more attack. The formats that they were played in, there simply weren't cards that did what they did, and that also were searchable by TRAPTRIX Myrmilio, so they ended up actually seeing play, unlike Gemini Trap Hole and Giant Trap Hole, which have pretty much always had replacements, and their searchability didn't make them any better. Anyway, though, that is going to wrap up my review of all the trap hole cards. I'm going to assume you probably saw part 1 if you watched this video, but if you didn't, I'll link it at the end of the video here so you guys can go on and watch the first set of trap holes. I was just going through them alphabetically because there were so many, there's almost 20 of them, and yeah, that'll wrap it up, so I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.